It's September 2017, and 800,000 people don't know if they'll be allowed to stay in the only country that they know. That number is the number of people under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA. Earlier this month, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the end to the program, asking Congress to come up with a solution in 6 months. The program was created by President Barack Obama as a way to deal with the thousands of people who entered the U.S. as children. Because it was an executive order, it can be easily overturned, and some on the right argue that the plan was an example of executive overreach. In one of America's biggest border cities, the issue of what to do with these de facto Americans is prescient. The issue has been hard for President Donald Trump as well, even though he campaigned on anti-immigrant rhetoric. Still, over Chinese food, Trump signaled that he'd be willing to work with the Democrats to pass legislation allowing DACA recipients to become Americans, something that has severely angered his base. Here's what we know. By applying to DACA, immigrants submit all of their information to the government. To apply, you needed to be younger than 16 when you crossed the border or overstayed your visa, and have done so before June 15, 2007. It is also required for these people to be upstanding citizens. They can't have a criminal record and need to have obtained or be in the process of getting educated. Then, they're allowed to legally live and work in the U.S. Maybe. To understand what this means for San Diego and the U.S., I spoke to the Union-Tribune's immigration reporter, Kate Morrissey. Our conversation was recorded before Trump's Chinese food summit, but her explanations still stand. I'm Daniel Wheaton, and this is Refocus. Kate, this has been an evolving story that you've been writing about for a while. Tons of stories that have been really great. Why don't you give us the overview of what's going on nationally and what it means to people in San Diego? Sure.
So nationally, there was just an announcement that DACA is going to be going away in about 6 months.
Good morning. I'm here today to announce that the program known as DACA that was effectuated under the Obama administration is being rescinded.
So that means people can't apply for it anymore as like a first-time applicant. They can still renew through the beginning of October if their DACA is going to expire before 6 months from now. If it expires after that, then on the expiration date of their DACA, they won't have it anymore, and they'll no longer have work authorization. They'll no longer have protection from deportation. So there's a lot of political debate and swirl around this topic. You have some conservatives who would support something like the DREAM Act. Like I said, that's a bipartisan movement. But there are others, particularly those who would identify as like an immigration restrictionist, somebody who believes in low levels of immigration and both wants to see the law enforced and more people who are not here with permission deported, as well as to see lower levels of legal immigration. So that group doesn't necessarily want to see the DREAM Act passed. They consider that an amnesty that sort of sets a precedent for others to think, oh, well, I can go to the U.S. and then some number of years from now, things are going to get so complicated again that Congress will give up and give me amnesty too, right? So that's the fear from that side, is that this will draw another wave of immigration that they don't want to see into the country. People seem to, regardless of which side they're on, unless they're pretty far on the limited immigration side, they seem to have a pretty strong sympathy for this particular group of individuals because of their stories and how they didn't really make the choice to come here, but they are here. And so you do see some support across the spectrum for doing something to help them in Congress. There's an act called the DREAM Act that would create a way for them to be here in a more permanent fashion and give them a little bit more rights even than what DACA gives them. And that was introduced with a bipartisan set of sponsors. So there's a lot of talk about whether or not that's actually going to go anywhere, but and a lot of different voices all around about how that should go down.
at the same time, you've also been interviewing people who are on this program and now they don't really know what their lives will be in the next 6 months. So now that the initial shock has passed for these individuals, what are the kind of stories and feelings that you're getting from these people when you walk us through that?
I think the strongest sense that I get from Dreamers when I talk to them about where they're at now is a sense of determination. Like, they are not done. They are not giving up. They are rallying and protesting and lobbying and calling everyone they can think to call. They're getting their neighbors to call Congress people. They're doing everything that they can to try and push for a solution to keep themselves in the country and working legally in the U.S.
And that seems to be part of the political calculus. I mean, Trump's essentially trying to force Congress's hand, but who's to say if Congress is actually going to solve it? And obviously this activism is kind of pushing people to actually do something to solve this crisis. When you paint a picture of what the DACA recipients are, when you hear discussion about it, it tends to be, oh, these kids, but that is somewhat of a misnomer. So why don't you explain, what is your average DACA recipient?
So if you actually have DACA, you have to be at least, I believe, 15 years old. You can't be any younger than that. So there are people who were about to turn 15 who now won't be able to apply for it once they reach that age. The thing is that they came to the U.S. before they were 16 years old. So many of them came to the U.S. when they were 5. I've met people who came when they were 1,
Wow.
Infants coming over, who really have all of their memories here in this country. At this point, there are many DACA recipients in their late 20s. I've met some in their 30s, who now have spent decades of life here and have been working legally for the last 5 years on the program. Because of the education requirements with the program and the sort of constant background checks, one of the things that I've heard from the DACA recipients is they think of themselves as like some of the most well-vetted immigrants in the country, because every 2 years they have to go and get fingerprinted by the government. They have to go through all of these different security checks. So,
yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you have some people who choose to fearmonger, and like the numbers are just completely destroying that argument that these are people that have been here for a long time and, in a sense, become de facto Americans in all but one reel, the final piece that makes a person officially an American. But given that we're so close to Mexico and we have many cross-border ties, do you find the conversation in San Diego being any different from what you're hearing nationally?
I think it's more that, the state of California has about 1/5 of the DACA recipients across the whole country. So when you talk about who's being affected, our state is definitely affected by this decision more than some of the other ones. So more Californians probably have neighbors or friends or coworkers who are DACA recipients than people in the rest of the country. Though I think what I see nationally in response to a lot of the stories that are being shared about Dreamers is pretty across the board. I do think it's worth pointing out that not all DACA recipients are from Mexico. There are DACA recipients from all over. I know in San Diego there's also a large, or at least relatively large population of Filipinos who are unauthorized immigrants. And so there are DACA eligible people in that community as well. They've had a harder time getting buy-in into the program from people from Asian countries. So just because you're DACA eligible doesn't mean you've actually applied.
That's interesting. Do you have any thought as to why that's the case, or it's just like messaging or cultural differences, or?
Well, it's a combination of things. There was a study that came out last year about that, sort of looking at where the gaps were in terms of eligibility versus people actually applying. And part of it is a cultural thing, the stigma of not having documents in those particular communities and like not talking about it. When you look at the Latino community, particular, the Mexican-American community, there's a pretty strong history of vocal activism from this particular group. Dreamers who are Mexican origin have been talking about their experiences for a little while now. That's part of how DACA came to be in the first place. That didn't come without its own set of activism. And so I think they've been in the spotlight a little bit more. And so once it came out, they were ready to start bringing it to their communities and pushing it and translating the documents into Spanish. And maybe those documents didn't also get translated into Tagalog right away, or some of the other major languages. So there was a push to try and do something about that, but I don't know that it got all the way there in the time that was left.
Yeah, that makes sense. When the infrastructure is there for people to get the information they need, be it from community centers, family, churches, it's a lot easier to do so than if you're, a smaller community, when we know San Diego is, much more Latino than it is Asian, even though we are a pretty diverse city. But interestingly, the UT and 10 News held a poll last week asking people what they thought about DACA. One of the questions was, do you think that Congress would actually come up with a solution in time for the 6-month deadline to occur? And I guess you mentioned earlier how dreamers tend to be very optimistic, and they're trying to, keep their hopes up to try to establish change. Do you think that they're more confident in Congress than regular Americans?
I don't know that they're more confident in Congress. I've heard them say a couple different ways, this sort of idea that like DACA doesn't define us, the DREAM Act doesn't define us. We're going to find a way, and sort of believing in that general positive future rather than necessarily putting faith in this particular Congress in the next 6 months, although there are many who are hoping, because what else can they do, that Congress will do something. I think in the more general population of people, there's a lot of skepticism given how difficult it's been for this Republican majority Congress to pass even Republican favored things. Although the recent passage of the I believe it's the debt ceiling, where the Democrats and President Trump sort of got together and had a meeting and came to some sort of consensus, that gave people some hope that something similar might happen with the DREAM Act.
Yeah, and it's actually just worth noting, during that meeting with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, afterwards Trump tweeted that there would be no action for people who are currently on DACA, like they wouldn't be rounded up by ICE today. When you saw that news, were you surprised? What was your reaction?
Since they still have their permits now, as long as they haven't gotten rid of them, I don't think it would stand to reason that they would try to go after people who they've promised that they still have a little while left. Mm-hmm. I don't know what will happen after permits start to expire. The administration has said that it's mostly targeting people with criminal backgrounds, which if you're on DACA, you don't have. But the administration is also focusing on people who have what are called prior orders of removal. So where a judge has already said, you can't stay here, you need to be deported. And whether you were deported and your mom brought you back, or whether your family just never left, that's the case for some DACA recipients and people who have applied for DACA but haven't gotten it yet, who I've met. Maybe their family came to apply for asylum. If their asylum is denied, they automatically get this removal order. So that's on their record. And that is a group that the Trump administration has been focusing on in the last 6 months or so. So for me, that's something that I'm definitely interested to see how that plays out, whether the fact that they were previously DACA will mitigate the fact that they have a removal order in any way.
In your reporting, you've also spoken to recipients of DACA. Why don't you walk us through some of the stories that you heard and what spoke out to you?
I interviewed many DACA recipients in the last couple of weeks, and one of the questions that I asked most of them was, what has DACA meant in your life? And the word that comes up over and over again is freedom. And whether that's freedom, I can now get a driver's license, freedom, I can now get a real job, freedom, I can now fly on a plane with identification, there's so many things that were normal in the lives of all of the people that they grew up with in elementary school, middle school, high school, that they watched their friends do, that they knew was not something that they could do. And then once they got DACA, it became like part of the realm of possibility for them. So that was pretty interesting.
It's really telling. I mean, in a sense, like these people are de facto Americans. And you're also currently working on a story of DACA recipients who are serving in the military. So what's the feeling from our troops?
So there's only one program that allows DACA recipients to join the military. Most of the military is closed off to you unless you have a green card or you're a U.S. citizen. But there's one program that is part of the Army that allowed DACA recipients to join. That program was actually pretty much stopped under the Obama administration last year, though there are still people who are going through the security clearance process for enrollment. And so now there's this sort of weird limbo, particularly for the ones who are DACA recipients, as to like what's going to happen, because it takes years to get through this process, and they don't have years necessarily still left on their permits from DACA. So they would not be protected while they're waiting.
So in covering this issue for a number of months, any last thoughts you'd like to leave with our audience?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting, sort of, I've noticed as you've asked me questions, you kept saying like, well, you know, these folks are de facto American, they're de facto American. And I'm always really interested in questions about identity. So I ask pretty much everyone who I interview on this topic, you know, like how they identify. Do they, you know, what do they consider themselves to be? And I get a pretty wide range of results. There are some who will very defiantly say, I am American, you know, and there are some who will say, you know I was born in Mexico. I am Mexican, and I believe in that side of my heritage as well, but this is my home, you know, and sort of drawing that distinction of like where you're from. You know, I've met several DACA recipients who were able to apply for this additional special program that allowed them to leave the U.S. once and come back with permission. And so the ones who I spoke with all went home to Mexico for the first time since they were kids, you know, and talking about seeing family that they had never seen before, or coming to understand the culture that they were born into but don't really know necessarily that much about. But they talk about it sort of like how I would think about visiting Ireland, which is where my great-great-grandfather is from. You know, it's something I'm interested in doing at one day, but it's not a homecoming in quite the same way that you might think about an adult who came here as an adult from another country would think about going back to the country they were born in. So it's been really interesting to get a sense of the complications in the identity of this particular group of people.
Kate Morrissey, thank you very much, and thanks for reporting this important story.
Thank you.
For Focus is a production of the San Diego Union-Tribune. This episode was produced and edited by Lauren Flynn and written by me, Daniel Wheaton. Special thanks to Kate Morrissey for speaking with us, and thank you, listener. Please, let us know what you think by rating and reviewing this podcast. And while you're at it, subscribe.